Morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to AP US History, as we look today at how the United States fought our first foreign war since the Mexican War, a war with Spain. Now, back in the early 1500s, when class began, the King of Spain, at least on paper, controlled half of Europe and claimed most of North and South America and other parts of the globe as well. By the late 1800s, however, Spain had lost most of that empire. It was very much a declining power, retaining only a few islands in the Caribbean, Cuba and Puerto Rico, a few islands in the Pacific, the Philippines and Guam, and a few claims here and there in Africa. In Cuba, in the Caribbean, close to the U.S., and the Philippines, close to Asia, and thus potentially a good trading base, military base, and coaling station, were particularly interesting to Americans. And with the frontier having filled in by 1890, some Americans were looking to go further afield, which was not unusual in the late 1800s. In the most powerful European nations, particularly Britain and France, had spent the 1800s taking over Africa and Asia. Japan had begun dominating its neighbors in East Asia, beating China in a war in 1894 to 95, and some Americans felt the United States should get in on this scramble for colonies around the world. One reason America wanted to expand, particularly in the tropics, was the sugar trade. Sugar was a valuable commodity, and many Americans had invested in sugar plantations in Hawaii, in Central America, and in Cuba, and wanted to protect their investments, particularly as some of those places had political problems. And they wanted to develop those islands, especially Cuba, as a place to sell more American products. And in Cuba, where local people had wanted independence from Spain for decades and fought for it unsuccessfully more than once, in 1895, a man named Jose Marti and others began a new war for Cuban independence. The Spanish were not going to lose the most valuable of their few remaining colonies and sent in the army, 150,000 troops, commanded by General Valeriano Valer, who brutally crushed the rebellion, earning himself the nickname Butcher Valer. Most infamously, he divided Cuba up into different sections and there imprisoned anyone who he thought might be a threat to Spanish rule in what he called reconcentration camps, vast prison camps, eventually imprisoning hundreds of thousands of Cubans if they or anyone they were associated with was suspected of possibly supporting independence. And while these are not the concentration camps that the Nazis dedicated to extermination a few decades down the road, they were still pretty harsh. Malnutrition, disease, and general mistreatment may have led to the death of at least 200,000 Cubans in these reconcentration camps, horrifying many Americans. Americans who were also distressed that American-owned sugar plantations were being destroyed. And many Americans sympathized with the Cubans. We remember our own Revolutionary War, of course, winning independence from a European empire, and of course American property was being damaged in the war too. But most of all, American newspapers covered the war in brutal detail, as newspapers were becoming a big business in the late 1800s too, as so many other things were, and to sell the most papers. Competing newspapers began to publish the most sensationalistic stories possible. This type of journalism was called yellow journalism or the yellow press. Possibly after the cheap newspaper it was printed on, paper so cheap it rapidly turned yellow. Or perhaps because one of the many ways they tried to sell newspapers was by inventing the comic strip. And one of the very first comic strips was called the Yellow Kid. A kid who wore a big yellow shirt. So popular, he may have given his name to the yellow press itself. And this was born again from the competition between Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, two major newspaper publishers in the United States. And everyone likes to think they want good news, but bad news is what sells. People buy papers or today tune into the radio, the television, the internet for tragedies and crises. And they understood this and sold their papers this way. And if they had to, they would exaggerate or even invent the details they needed to attract readership. Again, the yellow press is who described Baylor as a butcher. Brutal not just to Cubans, but ignoring the rights of Americans. A famous illustration appearing in the yellow press showed an American woman traveling through Cuba being strip searched by the Spanish authorities. In the late 1800s, to see a woman being stripped on the front page of the newspaper was pretty shocking stuff, period, especially if she's being stripped by foreigners. Some people would accuse the yellow press of even pushing America toward war in the hopes that war would sell more papers. And as Americans grew increasingly worried about events in Cuba, particularly the treatment of American travelers and American property in Cuba, President McKinley sent one of our modern steel-plated, steam-powered warships, the battleship USS Maine, to Havana Harbor to keep an eye on things in Cuba. Shortly after Maine was sent to Cuba, a private letter written by Spain's ambassador in the U.S. was somehow stolen by Cuban rebels and passed on to the yellow press, who immediately published this letter from Spain's ambassador describing President McKinley as weak and stupid. Now, over the years, I've heard American presidents during my lifetime called weak and stupid and other things. Whichever president it was, someone said that and more about him. But we can say that about our presidents. We don't want a bunch of foreigners calling our president weak and stupid. And some Americans called for war simply after that published insult. And so with Americans at a fever pitch, the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. They did a rapid investigation and concluded that a Spanish mine had blown up the ship. Although this has been investigated again multiple times, it is now pretty widely accepted the ship blew up on its own, that an electrical failure caused a spark, setting off an explosion in the powder magazine. But at the time it was believed that Spain had blown up one of our warships. Americans demanded war, saying, "Remember the Maine." And this desire for war for its own sake, is sometimes known as Jingoism, a term that came from the 1850s when many British subjects felt Jingoism at the prospect of a war with Russia over the Crimean Peninsula. There was a song popular in the 1850s in Britain, said, "We don't want to fight, but by Jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too." And so Jingoism ever since has been a desire for war for its own sake. And one man who had certainly desired war for its own sake, the chance to prove American manhood, was Theodore Roosevelt, who was, in the spring of 1898, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he really ran the Navy. As the actual Secretary of the Navy liked to take long lunch breaks that might last for weeks or months. And so even before America had declared war on Spain, Theodore Roosevelt had commanded George Dewey, commander of America's Pacific Fleet, based in Hong Kong, to set sail for Spain's colonies in the Philippines, just in case. And so when war was declared on April 25th, 1898, Dewey was already on the way to Manila Bay. He showed up on May 1st, 1898, and the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, in the Battle of Manila Bay, sank the entire Spanish fleet without losing a single American life in battle, although one man later died of heat stroke. This was due partly to the element of surprise, partly to America's superior ships, and partly to some outstanding command by Dewey. And besides bringing the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Dewey also brought with him Emilo Aguinaldo, who had been leading an independence movement in the Philippines for some time, although he had, for the past few years, been in exile in Hong Kong. But the U.S. brought him back with the promise that if he would lead Filipino forces against the Spanish alongside American forces, the U.S. would help him get independence for the Philippines. And over the next few months, American Filipino forces fought against the Spanish in the Philippines. On August 13th, 1898, U.S. General Wesley Merritt and the Spanish general in command of Manila agreed to stage a fake battle. The Spanish didn't want to surrender without a fight, but they also knew they would lose. They didn't want to have a real fight, so they agreed to stage a fake fight and then surrender. So America captured Manila, capital of the Philippines, August 13th, and U.S. forces marched in victory through the city. The Filipinos who had helped out were not allowed to take part, which they may have taken as a bad sign. Now, besides the Philippines, Spain also owned the tiny island of Guam in the Pacific. An island with a few natural resources, although very few, but mainly important as a potential coaling station and military base in the western Pacific. It was so isolated that the first time the Spanish soldiers stationed there knew there was a war between them and the U.S. is when the U.S. Navy showed up and told them, and they surrendered without a fight. But while America's first victories would be in the Philippines, the most famous battles would be in Cuba, which America had wanted since the early 1800s. And we believe seizing Cuba would be pretty easy. After all, it's only 90 miles away. But it wasn't so easy after all. The U.S. Army was pretty small when the war began, only about 28,000 men, whereas Baylor had gone to Cuba with 150,000. By this point, I believe Baylor has gone home and been replaced by another general. But the U.S. believed we would need about 250,000 men to invade Cuba, or in other words, we would need to increase the army to about 9 times its current size. And so, to do that, we would have to bring in as many volunteers as possible and also activate the state militias. But this was problematic because many of these state militias were, of course, based in the South. And for Southerners, the Civil War's only been over for 33 years, which in the South is not that long at all. There was some real concern whether Southerners would fight for the United States in Cuba. Indeed, if Southerners might not resist U.S. forces going through the South to sail from Florida to Cuba. In fact, many Southerners were eager for war with Cuba, and in some ways it helped to reunite North and South following Reconstruction. One way that was done was by recruiting a former Confederate general to lead U.S. cavalry in Cuba. Joseph Wheeler had tried to stop Sherman's advance through Georgia as a general in the Confederate Army. When the Spanish-American War broke out, Wheeler, now a congressman from Alabama, was asked to become a major general in the U.S. Army in command of all the cavalry, a position he accepted, making him the only man to have been a general in both the Confederate and U.S. armies over the course of his life. Although, at his age, especially once he got yellow fever in Cuba, there were some times he wasn't sure who he was fighting, and occasionally he told his men to go and get the Yankees, forgetting he's fighting the Spanish this time around. Of course, the most famous volunteers of all were those recruited by Theodore Roosevelt, who, of course, had grown up wealthy on the East Coast and knew much of the upper class of the East. Great athletes, polo players, men who were great horseback riders, at a time when the wealthy still rode horses rather than driving cars. But he'd also spent time as a rancher out west, and had met cowboys across the Great Plains. And so he tried to recruit from these two very different social classes, creating a famous volunteer unit known as the Rough Riders. But that does mean bringing a lot of men into the Army at once, which was not easy. Plus, the Army had trouble with supplies. Wool winter uniforms were sent to troops in Cuba, who then suffered from heat stroke. When they finally left Cuba and were waiting in camp outside New York City, when winter set in, they finally got their warm weather uniforms and then got hypothermia. Transporting horses to Cuba was almost a total failure. The Rough Riders, as their name suggests, were supposed to be a cavalry unit fighting on horseback, but in fact they only managed to get 2 horses there for the entire regiment. Canned beef provided to soldiers was of such poor quality, they had an investigation after the war. An investigative journalist, Upton Sinclair, would claim that more American soldiers were killed by spoiled beef than were killed by the Spanish. And so eventually the war would force many reforms on the Army and the militia system, most notably the Militia Act of 1903, which finally organized all the different state militias into the National Guard, more or less as we think of it today. Now, while Havana is the capital of Cuba, Cuba's main naval base was at Santiago on the southeastern end of the island. And there was a large part of its army there as well. So that became America's major target, not the capital at Havana, but the major port at Santiago. So the U.S. Army landed near Santiago from June 22nd to 24th, 1898, while the Navy blockaded Santiago, trapping the Spanish fleet in there for most of the war. Until very late, the Spanish, in an act of desperation, tried to break out, and then were mostly destroyed by the blockading fleet. Although the U.S. Navy had one concern, not so much the Spanish, but the possibility of hurricane season. And so, to have a place to take shelter should a hurricane blew in, the Navy and Marines took over Guantanamo Bay, not too far from Santiago, to make into a naval base, and where we could take shelter from hurricanes if we needed to. There were a few battles around Santiago, but the most famous of these is known as the Battle of San Juan Hill, although more properly the Battle of San Juan Heights, as there were several hills involved. There was a San Juan Hill. There was a hill known to Americans as Kettle Hill, because at the bottom of it were a lot of great big pots that had been used to boil sugar to refine it. And they were referred to by American soldiers as kettles. The Kettle Hill was probably more important than San Juan Hill, but I guess sounded less dramatic. Yeah. And the Battle of San Juan Hill was fought on July 1st, 1898, again just north of Santiago, hoping to cut Santiago off from the rest of the island, particularly from Spanish troops stationed in Havana, who were starting to head south. And this battle is famous for the participation of the Rough Riders in seizing Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill. But less well known, especially at the time, but probably even more important, was fighting by a group known as the Buffalo Soldiers, who at a time when the U.S. Army was still segregated by race, were black soldiers. They got them, although mostly with white officers. At this point, there were a few black officers commanding black troops, but very few. They were nicknamed the Buffalo Soldiers because American Indians they had fought on the Great Plains had given them that nickname, partly saying they were as brave as a buffalo, and also saying the color and texture of their hair was just like the hair of a buffalo. And Buffalo Soldiers, or black soldiers in the U.S. Army, played a big role in the Battle of San Juan Hill as well. In fact, while the Rough Riders are famous for their role in it, and have a famous photograph on top of the hill with the American flag, the first American flag raised on top San Juan Hill was raised by a black soldier from Jonesboro, Tennessee. One of the Buffalo soldiers who seized the hill first. Although one of the white officers of the Buffalo Soldiers is important as well, John J. Pershing, nicknamed Black Jack Pershing because he commanded black troops. At this point in the Spanish-American War, a fairly junior officer, but he's going to rise through the ranks over the next few years. When World War I breaks out, Black Jack Pershing will command the entire American expeditionary force in Europe. There were some other battles around Santiago after the Battle of San Juan Hill, but it was the key to surrounding the city, and Santiago surrendered July 17, 1898. U.S. forces also invaded Puerto Rico, where Spanish soldiers resisted and often fought small battles before retreating into the jungles to fight again. On the other hand, many Puerto Ricans supported the U.S. in hopes the United States would bring Puerto Rico independence once the Spanish were defeated. Fighting between the U.S. and Spain officially ended August 12, 1898, and actually ended shortly after that. A peace treaty officially went into effect April 11, 1899, so that the war lasted officially almost exactly 1 year. And it made the United States into an empire. This war that John Hay, America's Secretary of State, described as a splendid little war. A war in which the U.S. gained Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Guam and occupied Cuba, although it had been decided just as war was being declared that the U.S. would not keep Cuba, would make it an independent country if we could liberate it from Spain. Although within Cuba, the U.S. retained a perpetual lease on Guantanamo Bay, where the U.S. still has a naval base to this day. Within the United States, the Spanish-American War was viewed by many as a splendid little war. The U.S. lost fewer than 400 soldiers killed in battle, although more than 5,000 died of disease. It reinforced Americans' opinions in favor of a strong Navy, which continued to expand in the early 1900s. By the time World War I broke out, the U.S. had the third largest Navy on Earth, just barely behind Germany's, although still less than half the size of the British Navy. The war forced improvements in the Army's organization, federal regulation of the National Guard. It helped to reunite Northerners and Southerners, and also made Theodore Roosevelt into a national hero, which would soon lead him to be governor of New York and then vice president and eventually president, and one of our most significant and interesting ones. Still, as exciting as this victory was, there were many Americans who did not want America to become an imperial power. Indeed, just as war was breaking out, a number of prominent Americans founded the Anti-Imperialist League in 1898. Of them, probably the one who is still most famous today is the great writer Mark Twain, who was one of its founders and the vice president of the League from 1901 to 1910. Him feeling that imperialism was simply immoral, that the treatment of colonized people simply wasn't right, and wasn't American to rule over others in this way. Many others felt the same way. Former President Grover Cleveland was a prominent member, in feeling as he had felt when U.S. Marines helped to overthrow the monarchy of Hawaii, that this wasn't proper behavior for the United States. The labor leader, Samuel Gompers, was opposed to imperialism, both for the sake of the colonized people and because as a leader of the working class, he feared that newly colonized people might undercut the wages of American workers. The reformer Jane Addams from the Settlement House movement worried it would be too hard to assimilate all these very different people into American culture. The wealthy industrialist Andrew Carnegie was a prominent member of the Anti-Imperialist League, him being devoted to the cause of world peace in general. And while Mark Twain is today probably the most famous member of the Anti-Imperialist League, probably the most influential at the time was former and future presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan. When the Spanish-American War broke out, he had actually led a regiment of militia in Cuba, believing that liberating Cuba from Spanish rule was a good thing. But once it became clear the United States was likely to keep the places we were freeing from Spain, he then turned against imperialism in wanting to liberate other peoples, not rule over them. And so, in 1900, when William Jennings Bryan ran for the presidency for the second, but not last, time, while he still cared about free silver, his main issue would be anti-imperialism in the election of 1901. In an election that he would lose, again, to a Civil War veteran from Ohio, William McKinley, and a vice president from New York. But in this case, a new vice president from New York, the war hero Theodore Roosevelt. McKinley's first vice president having died near the end of his term, and some New York machine politicians wanting Theodore Roosevelt out of the way. Him being seen as a reformer, they wanted to put him in a position where nobody would ever hear from him again, and the vice presidency seemed perfect for that. Still, the anti-imperialists did succeed in one area. And just as war was being declared, the Teller Amendment was added to the declaration of war, stating that Cuba would not be annexed if it was conquered. So in Cuba, at least, we will not keep. However, while the U.S. did not keep Cuba and set it up as an independent country, the U.S. wrote Cuba's constitution. And furthermore, in the Congressional Act removing American troops from Cuba, another string was attached, the Platt Admendment, which gave the United States the right to intervene in Cuba whenever they needed it. Whenever Cuba needs help, we will send help. So it will be the U.S. who would determine if they needed help, and by help, we mean the Marine Corps. And while Cuba might remain officially independent, although in fact have the U.S. Marines show up several times to maintain order, everywhere else the U.S. definitely planned to keep, and had to decide what to do with. In Puerto Rico, the U.S. created a government through the Foraker Act, passed in 1900. Under the Foraker Act, creating a government for Puerto Rico, the United States would appoint the governor of Puerto Rico, and would continue to do so until 1948, when Puerto Ricans were finally allowed to elect their own governor. The U.S. would also choose part of Puerto Rico's legislature, although part would be elected by Puerto Ricans. In 1917, the Jones-Shafroth Act did go further and declared Puerto Ricans to be citizens, and gave them more control over their own legislature, although still not equal rights with other Americans. Of course, they were not a state, so they could not vote in national elections or be represented in Congress. There were some other limits on their rights as well, but as citizens, they could be taxed and they could be drafted. And I'm sure it's no coincidence that they became citizens and thus eligible for the draft, just as America was entering the First World War. But there were some people in America's new overseas territories who challenged their colonial status, the fact that their rights did not seem to be equal to those of other Americans. And this would reach the U.S. Supreme Court in a number of cases, which we refer to in general as the Insular Cases. Insular being a Latin word meaning related to islands. So a series of Supreme Court cases, mostly between 1901 to 1905, although sometimes some later cases are included too, questioning how the U.S. Constitution and American civil rights applied in America's new island territories. And what the Supreme Court declared was the Constitution does not follow the flag. Unlike other places the U.S. had gained in the past, in these new territories, people were not necessarily guaranteed equal rights with other Americans. And this was particularly notable in the Philippines, which turned out to be much easier to conquer than to occupy. Because during the Spanish-American War, the United States had fought alongside Filipinos who wanted independence from Spain, one of the main Filipino leaders being Emilo Aguinaldo. And of course, when the Spanish surrendered, Emilo Aguinaldo helped to create a Philippine Republic and was chosen to be its first president after issuing a Philippine Declaration of Independence. But despite what he thought, the U.S. decided to keep the Philippines, to have a good trading base and military post near Asia, and the U.S. did not recognize the Philippine Declaration of Independence. And pretty soon, fighting broke out between Filipinos who wanted their independence and the U.S. who wanted to keep them. What was known at the time as the Philippine Insurrection, an insurrection being an uprising. Today, many people prefer the term Philippine-American War. And this is usually considered to begin in 1899, although there was a bit of fighting even in late 1898. And this would be largely a guerrilla war. The Filipinos would fight out the jungles and out of villages, hitting the U.S. Army behind our own lines, and it being hard to tell who was whom. The U.S., in return, fought a war of extermination under the command of the U.S. military governor, General Arthur McArthur, a decorated veteran of the Civil War. And both sides fought in the most brutal fashion they could, often on both sides torturing prisoners if they took them at all. You did not want to be captured by the Filipinos if you were an American soldier. They might just bury you alive. Or they might bury you up to your neck near an anthill and let the ants finish you off. Or they might tie you to a tree near an anthill and cut open your stomach, and when your bowels fell out, spread marmalade on them. So the ants would come and eat the marmalade, then eat your intestines and work their way in from there. American soldiers were sometimes castrated and the removed parts stuffed in their mouth. So if you didn't die of shock or blood loss, you would suffocate on your own removed parts. Although sometimes American soldiers would be freed after being captured, although first they would keep them in captivity with people with infectious diseases, and then send them back to American lines, hoping to spread the disease to other Americans. Some Filipinos, especially Spanish-born Catholic priests, did support the U.S., and sometimes they were murdered, even mutilated, in front of their church congregations, as were others who refused to support the uprising. Of course, American soldiers didn't go easy on the Filipinos. Those who tried to surrender might just be shot. Others were given the water cure, pictured there at the bottom. Here you've put a funnel in someone's mouth and you pour in water and keep going. This may cause a man's bladder to burst, or his stomach to burst, or his stomach may fill up with water. Water may come all the way up his throat to a little flappy thing, to use a medical term, then pour down the other way into his lungs. Filipinos might be put in concentration camps, not so different from the ones we condemned the Spanish for using in Cuba. Philippine insurrectos who were sentenced to death were executed in the Spanish style, which is to say they were strangled to death with a rope, which was Spain's method of execution from the late Middle Ages up until the early 20th century, and which the U.S. adopted in the Philippines when we took over. Eventually, some American officers were put on trial for what we would now call war crimes. Many captured Filipino leaders were executed, but war crimes were certainly carried out on both sides and often went unpunished. Still, many people saw this as necessary, as America many people felt had a role in the Philippines to bring them civilization, to teach them English, to end the role of the Catholic Church in the government, to convert the large Muslim minority in the southern Philippines to Christianity, and in general to make the Philippines as much like America and Europe as possible. To, as some people put it, take up the white man's burden, and to lift up the less advanced races. There we see an American soldier carrying a Filipino up the hill to the schoolhouse, whether he wants to go or not. Emilio Aguinaldo was captured by U.S. forces in 1901 and only allowed to go free after swearing allegiance to the United States and asking his followers to stop fighting, which most did by 1902. So we usually consider the Philippine Insurrection to last from 1899 to 1902, and there was a little fighting even in 1898, and some remote areas, particularly in the southern Philippines, some violence lasted at least until 1913. The southern Philippines, in having a large Muslim population, many of whom wanted to be independent not just from the United States, but from the rest of the Philippines as well. More than 5,000 Americans died in the Philippine insurrection, far more than 10 times the number killed in battle during the Spanish-American War itself. It's estimated at least 200,000 Filipinos were killed in the violence. Now, another reason the violence declined, besides Aguinaldo surrendering, was General Arthur McArthur, who was willing to use very harsh treatment on the Filipinos, was replaced by a civilian governor, William Howard Taft, who treated the Filipinos with much greater respect. For example, inviting prominent local Filipinos to have dinner at the governor's mansion, which the army officers who had ruled before did not allow them to do. He allowed the Filipinos some self-government, although he did, at times, limit freedom of the press and freedom of speech for people who actively protested against American rule. And he did still somewhat look down on the Filipinos, describing them as our little brown brothers. But better, I guess, to be a little brown brother than to be someone the army simply trying to exterminate. And when Taft did go back to the United States to serve as Secretary of War, and later become president, he was deeply missed by the Filipinos. In 1916, the Jones Act promised that the Philippines could have their independence one day. And after a gradual process granting the Philippines more and more independence, which was then interrupted by the Japanese in 1942, I guess late 41, the Philippines did gain their independence completely in 1946. All the U.S. would continue to have military bases in the Philippines for years afterwards. And Emilio Aguinaldo did live to see Philippine independence, even got a short, mostly ceremonial role in the new government of the independent Philippine Republic late in his life. But despite these difficulties, by the beginning of the 20th century, the United States was an imperial power to match any of the ancient powers of Europe.